Hello and welcome to Tier 3 of the Bad Movie Iceberg. If you've stumbled onto this video and haven't seen our previous two, I'd recommend you pause this one and then dedicate the next hour or so of your life watching 1 and 2 so that you're all caught up. And so that you don't inevitably join us in the future on a random tier and then don't know where we're up to, I'd recommend clicking the subscribe button as well so that you never miss a future upload. Alright, on to Tier 3. Blood Rain is a 2005 fantasy action horror film directed by Uwe Boll and based on the video game series of the same name. Hindsight is 2020, but I have no clue how any production company can hear video game adaptation and Uwe Boll in the same sentence and come to the conclusion that that is a good investment. Blood Rain is set in 18th century Romania and follows Rain, a human-vampire hybrid, as she journeys off to her evil vampire father. The critical consensus states that Blood Rain is an absurd sword and sorcery vid game adaptation from schlock maestro Uwe Boll, featuring a distinguished and slumming cast. The film was nominated for 6 Golden Raspberry Awards, including Worst Picture, Worst Actress, Worst Supporting Actor, Worst Supporting Actress, Worst Director, and Worst Screenplay. Caligula is a 1979 erotic historical drama film focusing on the rise and fall of the Roman Emperor Caligula. The film is notorious for its unsimulated sex scenes, which should come as no surprise, as the film was actually produced by Bob Guccione, the founder of Penthouse magazine. Because of how graphic these sex scenes are, the uncut version of Caligula is actually banned to this day. The critical consensus for the film states, endlessly perverse and indulgent, Caligula throws in hardcore sex every time the plot threatens to get interesting. However, don't let the boobies distract you from how bad this film fundamentally was. Roger Ebert gave it 0 stars, calling it sickening, utterly worthless, shameful trash. It was actually one of the few films that Ebert ever walked out of, and he walked out 2 hours into its 170-minute length after feeling quote-unquote disgusted and unspeakably depressed. Dungeons & Dragons is a year 2000 American fantasy adventure film directed by Courtney Solomon and based on the role-playing game of the same name, D&D. The critical consensus of the film states, this movie has a cheap look and is badly directed. Despite the presence of talented actors, the performances are really bad. And additionally, some people are offended at Marlon Wayne's character, calling it a racist throwback to black stereotypes. Now, Courtney Solomon blamed the quality of the film on its investors and license holders' interference, as well as his own inexperience, I guess, in filmmaking. He actually states that he only intended to produce the film, but was forced to direct it by his investors after nearly a decade of complications dealing with TSR and Wizards of the Coast. He also claims that he was forced to use an older script, despite having written an updated version that sort of fit that D&D licensing better. Fateful Findings is a 2012 American independent science fiction film directed, written, produced, and edited, and starring Neil Breen. Now, if you're watching this video, you probably know who Neil Breen is, and honestly, it's hard to explain Mr. Breen without falling down a massive rabbit hole, but for the uninitiated, all you really need to know is that he's a guy who makes stinky films. And his closest comparison is probably Tommy Wiseau, but I don't really know if that's fair on either party. Now, Mr. Breen has never disclosed the budget of his films, but by a quick eyeball analysis, we definitely aren't AAA. The movie's panned for its incomprehensible plot, poor production values, overt political messages, stilted dialogue, and bizarre and unnatural performances, which leads to the scene that this movie is probably best known for. You getting tired of Uwe Boll video game adaptations? Cause I'm getting tired of Yui Bowl video game adaptations. House of the Dead is a 2003 action horror film directed by Yui Bowl and based on Sega's video game franchise of the same name. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why didn't Yui Bowl adapt Sonic? One of life's greatest questions. The film's a prequel to the events of the video game series and follows a group of college students who travel to a mysterious island to attend a rave, which is soon taken over by bloodthirsty zombies. Which is ironic, because there was definitely no brains to be found anywhere near the production of this movie. The critical consensus for this film states that the film is a quote-unquote grungy, disjointed, mostly brainless mess of a film. House of the Dead is nonetheless loaded with unintentional laughs. And to make matters worse, Time magazine actually listed the film on the list of the top 10 worst video game movies of all time, and this one is number 6 on IMDb's lowest rated movies of all time, so it's pretty bad. The 2007 psychological thriller I Know Who Killed Me, directed by Chris Sivertson and starring Lindsay Lohan, Julia Ormond, Neil McDonough and Brian Gertie, it follows Aubrey Fleming, who mysteriously disappears one night and when found, has no recollection of her past life and instead identifies herself as Dakota Moss, a character that she created for one of her assignments. The critical consensus states, distasteful and ludicrously plotted, I Know Who Killed Me is a career nadir for all involved, particularly Lindsay Lohan in a dual role. Now, this film was actually pretty well acted, but it has a large number of plot inconsistencies and questionable dialogue and pretty heavily forced symbolism as well, such as the really in-your-face use of the colours red and blue, which represent each twin. Spoiler alert, I guess. Seems like a lot of the criticism actually directed towards this film is due to the public perception of Lindsay Lohan at the time, because these days there seems to be some kind of reborn appreciation for the film. That being said, the film did win 8 out of the 9 Razzies that it was nominated for, including Worst Picture. The third and final movie in the Look Who's Talking trilogy, Look Who's Talking Now, stars John Travolta and Kirstie Alley and features the voices of Danny DeVito and Diane Keaton. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the first 2 films, Look Who's Talking and Look Who's Talking 2, basic consensus is that John Travolta and Kirstie Alley have babies whose thoughts are expressed through their inner monologues because they can't talk. Obviously. And they were initially voiced by Bruce Willis, Joan Rivers, and Roseanne Barr, who, by the way, do not reprise their roles in this film. Basically, in this film, James and Maddie are expanding their family by adopting a street dog and a pedigree poodle who talk to each other as the kids are now old enough to actually communicate. So basically, this gag is carried out through the family adopting dogs. So we're hearing the dogs' inner monologues. It received negative reviews from critics and underperformed at the box office, grossing $10.3 million against a production budget of $22 million. Now, I, like everyone else on this planet, love Danny DeVito, but he couldn't quite save this one. It's just a bit boring, and the joke's overdone, and I don't really have anything else to say on this one. Manos, The Hands of Fate is a 1966 supernatural folk horror film written, directed, and produced by Harold P. Warren. Now, the first step in trying to even attempt to understand Manos, The Hands of Fate is the context of why this film was even made in the first place. So the story allegedly goes that Harold Warren, an insurance and fertilizer salesman, made a bet with a screenwriter stating that filmmaking is easy and that he could create a successful horror film on a tiny budget. Spoiler alert, he did not succeed. Because of the tiny budget, practically no one on or behind the camera had any film experience at all. Manos the Hands of Fate was a more or less unknown until 1993 when it starred on an episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000, which exposed this movie to the masses and catalyzed the cult following it now has. It's difficult to really summarize the critical reception of this movie, apart from saying that it's just one of the worst films ever. Literally ranking second on IMDb's worst rated movies, only behind Disaster Movie. More glaringly, however, is the fact that the film wasn't actually shot with sound and was later dubbed by just 3 actors. I mean, the little girl in the film was just straight up dubbed by an adult. It's just weird. Oh, and finally, and I swear we will move on after this, but for my Spanish-speaking friends out there, I'm sure you've noticed that Manos translates to hands, making the title of this film Hands, the Hands of Fate. One Missed Call is a 2008 supernatural horror film directed by Eric Valette and written by Andrew Clavin, and it's a remake of the 2003 Japanese film of the same name, and like literally every other American remake of a Japanese IP, it wasn't as good as the original, and in this case, a lot worse than the original, and the original wasn't even that good. Unfortunately, the film has a pretty cool plot concept, following several people who start receiving voicemails from their future selves, messages which include the date, time, and some of the details of their deaths. The critical consensus states that the film is one of the weakest entries in the J-horror remake sweepstakes, and One Missed Call is undone by bland performances and shop-worn shocks. Aside from being extremely poor in quality, the film has also been panned for, let's say, being heavily influenced by Scream, Final Destination, The Ring, The Grudge, Dark Water, and Pulse. Alright, so I know that the phrase worst film ever has been thrown around a lot in this iceberg. But if you had to aggregate throughout history which film has earned the title from the most amount of different outlets, it's probably Plan 9 from Outer Space. Like, come on, it's even referenced as the worst movie of all time in Seinfeld. Plan 9 from Outer Space is a 1957 science fiction horror film produced, written, directed, and edited by Ed Wood. Now, for those who don't know, Ed Wood is the granddaddy of the so bad it's good genre, and in my opinion, is the first ballot in the Hall of Fame of stinky directors. Look, just out of sheer output, I'd probably rank him above Tommy Wiseau and Neil Breen. Yeah. But you know what? The Tim Burton movie about this film was pretty good. Anyway, Plan 9 from Outer Space follows an alien invasion as these aliens launch their Plan 9, which sets to raise the dead for their evil army. So yep, you get aliens and zombies for the price of one here. The critical consensus states, the epitome of so bad it's good cinema. Plan 9 from Outer Space is an unintentionally hilarious sci-fi thriller from anti-genius Ed Wood that is justly celebrated for its staggering ineptitude. I don't think I want to say anything more about Plan 9 from Outer Space. I just implore you to watch it if you haven't already. And then maybe watch Tim Burton's Ed Wood. It's good. You won't regret it. Police Academy Mission to Moscow is a 1994 action comedy film starring George Gaydos, Michael Winslow, David Graff, and Claire Filani. It's the 7th and final installment in the Police Academy franchise to date, and the sequel for Police Academy 6, City Under Siege. Basically, the film follows the veterans of the original Police Academy as they are hired by the Russian government to help deal with the mafia. Film critic Leonard Maltin stated, "If the United States and Soviet Union were still at odds, this film would make a great weapon it could bore people to death. Problem Child is a 1990 comedy starring John Ritter, Michael Oliver, Gilbert Gottfried, and Amy Yasbeck. The film follows a couple who decide that they want to adopt a sweet little child to call their own, and instead are gifted with Junior, a metaphorical demon child who makes Dennis the Menace look like an angel. Now the critics, they didn't like this one. The consensus states, mean-spirited and hopelessly short on comic invention, Problem Child is a particularly unpleasant comedy, one that's loaded with manic scenery chewing and juvenile pranks. It's interesting. Problem Child absolutely smashed the box office to pieces, grossing $72.2 million worldwide against a production budget of only $10 million. But this didn't stop, obviously, those critics from tearing this film to shreds. And why, you might ask? One-dimensional characters, potty humour, and overly mean jokes. The film also didn't go down too well with animal rights activists, because for the promotional poster for the film, Junior puts a cat in the washing machine, and even though this doesn't actually happen in the film, there were apparently protests about it. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film's got a rare approval rating of 0% based on 29 reviews and an average rating of 2.27 out of 10. Slenderman is a 2018 supernatural horror film directed by Sylvian White. Now, this film's based on that creepypasta which took over the internet for I want to say a month or two in the early 2010s. Anyway, back to this film. It sucks. It follows small town best friends Haley, Chloe, Ren, and Katie who go online to try and conjure up the Slenderman. And then 2 weeks later, Katie mysteriously disappears during a class trip to a historic graveyard. Determined to find her, the girls soon suspect that the legend of Slenderman may all be too true. Now, the elephant in the room with Slenderman is that it was released 4 years after the Slenderman stabbings, which I don't want to get into, but I agree that the whole movie, when it was released, was quite distasteful. The critical consensus of the film states that Slenderman may be thin, but he's positively robust compared to the flimsy assortment of scares generated by the would-be chiller that bears his name. On top of that, Jazz Sinclair was nominated for the Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Supporting Actress. In their film debut, Spice World follows the British girl group The Spice Girls as they find themselves in weird, wacky and wonderful situations on their way to perform a concert at London's Royal Albert Hall, all while being pursued by an evil journalist who wishes to destroy their reputation. Something along those lines, anyway. The film is a comedy that definitely wasn't created in the vein of being a prestigious, world-changing, highbrow piece of cinema, for sure. Spice World's a feel-good, campy, silly time whose plot I would say is a satire on the British tabloids, fame, and their own spicy personas. But the film's also just a bit odd, for the sake of being odd. Like, at one stage they run into aliens who just really want to go to their show. But from memory, I don't think that they can. They want to get their autographs. Anyway, that's relevant. The film is essentially a 90s take on the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night, albeit with more girl power and bolder fashion choices thrown into the mix. Now, this film is a film for the fans, not for the critics. And the critical consensus reads, Spice World's lack of cohesive plot will likely lose most viewers, but for fans of the titular girl group, there's more than enough fun to be had in their wacky, albeit superficial, whirlwind of an adventure. Super Babies, Baby Genie Says 2 is a 2004 American family comedy film directed by Bob Clark and written by Gregory Poppin, and is a sequel to the 1999 film Baby Geniuses. A group of smart talking toddlers find themselves at the center of the media mogul's experiment to crack the code on baby talk, and the toddlers must race against time for the sake of babies everywhere. Baby Geniuses 2 was panned by critics and is often regarded as one of the worst films of all time. Now, the film was a box office bomb, earning less than half of its budget back, with the critical consensus stating, "A startling lack of taste pervades Super Babies. A sequel offering further proof that bad jokes still aren't funny when coming from the mouths of babies." The film was nominated for 4 Razzies for Worst Supporting Actor, Worst Screenplay, Worst Picture, and Worst Director. Nah, screw you all. This movie is my childhood, and I actually refuse to talk bad on it. Fight me. I'm just gonna sit here and talk to Bert for 10 seconds. What do you think about Sharkboy and Lava Girl, Bert?
I love it. It is a cinematic masterpiece that holds no equals.
Bert agrees. Moving on. The Cost of Deception is a 2021 Hungarian political drama action thriller film centered around the 2006 Ozod speech made by former Hungarian Prime Minister Ferenc Gyurcsány. I'm sorry for that. For context, the Ozod speech was a confidential speech made by the Prime Minister to the Hungarian Socialist Party, which he pretty much just flat out said that the party lied to win the election, just with a lot more profanity. Now, this film was criticised for its discussion of contemporary political events and figures, and allegedly painting several members of the opposition parties in negative light. But, as clearly a non-Hungarian with zero knowledge of Hungarian politics, I'm not touching this one with a 2-meter pole. The Fog is a 2005 supernatural horror film directed by Rupert Wainwright and is a remake of the 1980 cult classic horror film of the same name, directed by John Carpenter, who also produced this remake. The film tells the story of a strange fog that sweeps in over an island off the coast of Oregon, bringing with it the vengeful spirits of mariners who were murdered there 134 years prior. The townsfolk find themselves trapped and fighting for their lives while discovering the truth of their dark history. The critical consensus of the film states, The Fog is a so-so remake of a so-so movie, lacking scares, suspense, or originality. The Hottie the Nutty is a 2008 American romantic comedy film starring Paris Hilton. Now, aside from having literally one of the worst titles in cinematic history, the film was a huge box office failure, grossing a measly $1.6 million on a $9 million budget. Now, the film is about 2 best friends, one of them described as hot and the other one as not. And the hot one agrees to go on a date with a man, but only if he finds a date for her unattractive best friend. I don't know why I just said that like that, but that's how I felt when I was watching the film. Now, critical consensus of the film states that The Hottie and the Nutty is a crass, predictable, and ineptly staged, gross-out comedy that serves little purpose beyond existing as another monument to Paris Hilton's vanity. Now, the film was nominated for the Razzie for the Worst Picture, Worst Screenplay, and Worst Director, and it won Worst Actress and Worst Couple. I love Paris Hilton. The 2001 flick The Human Centipede II full sequence was written, directed, and co-produced by Tom Six. It follows Martin, a deeply disturbed individual who lives with his abusive mother. He is inspired by the efforts of Dr. Heiter, the creator of the 3-person Human Centipede in film 1, to create his own 12-person Human Centipede. But in this film, Human Centipede 1 is also a film, so he's inspired by the fictional events of the first film in a fictional film. It's kind of a cool concept, but I also don't feel like I'm allowed to say that about the Human Centipede. Now, without going into too much information, Human Centipede II is deeply disturbing. I don't think I'm adding anything new here by saying that. But this film was so disturbing that the initial cut of the film was actually refused a classification rating by the British Board of Film Classification, as it was deemed too extreme for even an 18 certificate. Now, Tom Six and the BBFC did eventually come to an agreement, with a censored cut of the film being granted an 18 certified. Although the film was actually filmed in colour, Human Centipede 2 is in black and white, which somewhat helps, I guess, with the goriness. I'm just gonna move on from this. I think I've talked about Human Centipede enough. The Open House is a 2018 horror film written and directed by Matt Angel and Suzanne Coote. The film follows a mother and son following the death of their husband/father. Struggling financially, they are forced to sell their house and move to a secluded location in the mountains. Now, this film's just riddled with a catalogue of horror cliches, which just, I guess, eliminates any possibility of tension, but at least created a great count the cliche drinking game for me. Like, literally nothing happens in this film until right at the end, which in itself is lackluster. It's just pretty much 70 minutes of... Oh, something's moved. Oh my god. I hope there isn't a murderer about. I hate it. Moving on. The 2019 film The Queens Corgi is an animated family film directed by Vincent Caisslute and Ben Strassen. It follows the story of Rex, the Queen's favourite corgi, who, after biting Donald Trump, ends up lost from the palace and must make new friends and embrace new adventures in order to find his way back to the palace. This story is just nothing new. When a troubled main character becomes distant from the life they once knew, they must make some unlikely friends who then morph them into a better person, or dog, I guess in this case, than they were in the beginning. Like, I'm bored. I could name like 5 films off my head that do that. The film was also criticised for its strangely raunchy nature, with a lot of the jokes and references being deemed as just way too sexual for kids to be watching, and I thought that this was a dramatic take, but after watching the film, they were right. There are some strangely sexual undertones. It didn't really do its job of working on 2 levels. It's just kind of stuck on like a weird in-between level that makes it weird. I don't know. It's weird. Moving on. Titanic, The Legend Goes On is an Italian year 2000 animated film written and directed by Camillo Tetti. Now, the film follows the lower class Angelica, who falls in love with the upper class Sir William aboard the RMS Titanic, and it also follows a cast of animal characters, all of which are also embarking on their own journeys. This film? Wild. According to IMDb, there are actually 2 American versions of this film done with the same cast. We have an uncut dub and a drastically cut and re-edited dub. It features just a completely different plot, different songs, and different dialogue. Entire scenes were edited in different sequences, and others just have been removed or reused or placed before other scenes. It's just crazy. Speaking of reused, many of the characters in this film seem eerily familiar too. There's definitely a likeness between various Disney characters. It's pretty obvious that they've completely stolen the design. The animation's shoddy, there's not really much going on or to really follow, and then that happy ending just kind of glosses over the real tragedy that was the Titanic. Also, that plot, that's literally just, that's just James Cameron's Titanic, isn't it? It's just completely ripped off. Now, my favourite part in this film is there's a bit where a dog starts randomly rapping to a song called Party Time. And he's like the only voice actor who's got any heart and is just putting his all into it. It's... shout out to Rapping Dog. This film's crazy. Troll 2 is a dark fantasy horror film written and directed by Claudio Fragasso. Hearing the title Troll 2 instantly makes me think of the "Oh my god" clip. Isn't it silly? The film follows a vacationing family who discover that the entire town that they're visiting is inhabited by goblins who are disguised as humans who plan to eat them. The film was conceptually just wacky. Like, even though it's marketed as a sequel to the 1986 film Troll, there's no connection at all. Oh, and also, Claudio Fragasso, the director and writer, wasn't fluent in English, which of course translated into a fundamentally broken script. Now, J.R. Jones, a reviewer on the Chicago Reader, I think put it perfectly when they stated, "The script is stupid, the acting is wooden, the special effects are laughable, and the vintage 80s synthesizer score is cheesy. The movie's paranoid premise is boiled down from two superior sci-fi movies, Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Day of the Triffids. And there are no trolls." Now, Fragasso has gone on to state that their intentions have apparently been misunderstood, as the strongly criticised aspects of this film are apparently intentionally comedic and exaggerated. And that, my friends, is tier 3 of the bad movie iceberg. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more future ones like this one here, then I would really love and appreciate it if you like this video and subscribe to the channel, because it really helps us out a lot. Anyway, with that being said, thank you so much for watching.